we're good to go.
Okay, hi. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Kate Wilson, and thank you so much for coming and answering our questions today. We're going to do 9 questions. I'm going to do the first 4, and then I'm going to do the second 4. Okay, so to get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a professor at Atlanta Metropolitan College and Georgia Tech, and what some of your jobs and duties are there?
So I am an associate professor of history at Atlanta Metropolitan State College, and I teach United States history before the Civil War, after the Civil War. I teach African American history, African American culture, African American studies, and I'm a visiting associate professor at Georgia Tech. I'm a visiting associate professor at Georgia Tech, and this year I'm teaching African American history, women in United States history, and U.S. history. And my research is on African American women in the 20th century who are part of a movement called Pan-African Cultural Nationalism, and I just researched their leadership in that movement.
Okay, and can you tell us about the experiences of African Americans, especially these living in the states like Georgia, after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era? And was it difficult for African Americans to have their civil rights guaranteed and protected?
Sure. African Americans after the Civil War and during Reconstruction had, if you can imagine, it was a time of great upheaval. The city, the area was devastated. Thousands of acres of farmland had been destroyed. Factories had been destroyed. Railroads were pulled up and twisted so that goods could not flow into the Confederacy. The Atlanta area was a hub for the Confederacy in terms of the railways. So you can imagine the African Americans' homes were destroyed, as well as white Americans. Plantations were destroyed, farms were destroyed, and that included the quarters where African Americans might have lived. So there was a lot of hunger, there was a lot of homelessness. People were without a way to make a living, feed their families, and so they're trying to make a way. And it's an agrarian society. So you can imagine that land is very important for African Americans. Many African Americans sought land so that they could provide for themselves, provide for their people. So one thing that happened is that there were about 20 African American leaders who in early 1865, which is 1865 is the end of the Civil War, met with General William Tecumseh Sherman to tell them about this situation that African Americans were facing with landlessness, with homelessness. You can imagine a lot of people were orphaned. So not just because of deaths in the war, but because their families had been separated during slavery, and that people needed a place to go. So one of the outcomes of that meeting was Sherman's Special Field Order 15. And that really was a vision where there would be land allotted to freed people from the Carolinas through Georgia down into Florida so that they could settle in, start farms, and make a living. But most people never got access to that land. Most African Americans never got access to that land. And the few who did get access, one thing that comes next on the timeline is that Abraham Lincoln is assassinated in April 1865. So Andrew Johnson was the vice president that became president. And Andrew Johnson didn't have any love for the freedmen. He didn't have any love for the freed people who came, who were enslaved, and now they're trying to make their way in the world. A lot of his sympathies were with Southern slaveholders. So one thing Johnson did was he went about pardoning these Southern slaveholders. And when they were pardoned, or former slaveholders, the former rebels, and when they were pardoned, they would come back and try and claim their land, and the deeds to the land were taken away from African Americans. So that's one way they were disfranchised in society after the Civil War. Another way that they were disfranchised was politically. Right at the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's real major concern was to put the Union back together. And African American voting rights were not a high priority on his list. And when it seemed he was coming around to the idea of African Americans voting, again, he was assassinated. So, I know you all are familiar with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which are major milestones during Reconstruction. So the 13th gives African Americans citizenship. The 13th frees African Americans from chattel slavery. The 14th gives them citizenship, and the 15th gives African American men the right to vote. So you think it's ratified in 1870, and so African American men could just go out and vote, right? And they were very motivated to vote. Many African American men voted, elected other African American men to office. For instance, one of the most notable African American men elected to office in Georgia was Henry McNeill Turner. Another man was Tunis Campbell. So these are examples of African American men who were voted into office. But to white supremacists, particularly those who were aligned with the Democratic Party, those who were more moderate Republicans, African Americans voting was very offensive. And the offense they took eventually grew into anger. And the Democratic Party and paramilitary formations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia formed during this time to remove Republicans, in particular African Americans, who they felt were inferior and never fit for voting or holding office or governance at all. And they would use terrorism to physically sometimes remove people from office, stop people from voting. And that was just one method. There are other methods that African Americans had to deal with, like eventually white primaries, where the parts of the voting process that were left to state governments in the South, Southern lawmakers would write, these primary elections are only open to whites. So that way, by the time African Americans come to the poll, who can they vote for? People who had been elected initially, nominated initially at conventions by white Americans. And so over time, what happens is a wholesale disfranchisement of African American men in terms of Reconstruction, in terms of the right to vote. So that's another way that they were disfranchised. A third way would be black codes. So once the Civil War was over, African Americans were granted citizenship, freed from enslavement and then granted citizenship. Local and state politicians went about making codes that essentially were designed to ensure a workforce that was servile and inexpensive, for them, and that was dominated, that was directed by white Americans. So if you went back and you looked at black codes, you would see there were some things that were different than slavery. African Americans could legally go into a contract. African Americans could legally testify in court, unlike before, during chattel slavery. African Americans could legally get married, which they could not do during chattel bondage. But black codes also they had ordinances and laws that would stop people from loitering. They had vagrancy laws, which meant if it was difficult for you to get a job, right? You had been enslaved and now you're looking for a job, it becomes illegal to not have a job. And once a person was arrested, they might be arrested and fined. If they couldn't pay the fine, well, how could you pay the fine? You hadn't been paid, you didn't get any back pay for all the labor you had done, right? Then you could essentially be sold to the highest bidder. Black codes had laws in terms of labor contracts and labor relations. So African Americans would often have to go into a labor contract that didn't allow them to protest, no matter how bad the conditions were. It didn't allow them to leave the job. So basically these black codes were ordinances and laws that really instated a situation that was just a little bit better than slavery. Some, like the author Douglas Blackman would say, slavery by another name. So that's another way that they were disfranchised. So they were disfranchised socially, politically, and economically during Reconstruction.
Okay, can you tell us about the period of the Progressive Era in World War I? And how did this Industrial Revolution and First World War impact African Americans in the States?
Okay, so I want to break the question down. So the first part of the question is about the Progressive Era.
Yes.
So you can imagine Reconstruction is undone by 1877 when Rutherford B. Hayes takes the presidency. And he has this gentleman's agreement with the Democratic Party that, of course, wanted to regain power in the United States, and did everything, you know, all these dirty tricks using violence and, you know, the grandfather clause and all kinds of things, right? To regain power and to reinstate white supremacy. So Rutherford B. Hayes had to agree to some, who was a Republican, had to agree to some, you know, doing things a certain way. So initially what he agrees to is restoring Southern home rule. So basically the South, the troops are pulled out of the South who had been put there to make sure that Reconstruction proceeded, and had to allow Southern Democrats, white supremacists, to take over the South again. And Reconstruction ended earlier in Georgia. It ended in 1871. So the Republicans who had been elected to office in the state of Georgia they lost power by 1871. So what follows in African American history and African American studies is often called the nadir of African American history, the nadir of race relations in the United States. And nadir just means low point, the lowest point. So African Americans, what civil rights that they were able to gain during Reconstruction were severely curtailed. This is the age of Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, that instates the separate but equal doctrine. So basically some people have compared this era to apartheid in South Africa, but it's called in U.S. history the era of Jim Crow. And Jim Crow was a minstrel character. And I don't know if you're familiar with minstrels, but minstrels were white, usually males, who would dress up and paint their faces black and draw on big red lips to caricature African Americans. And they would do things in a very exaggerated, often degrading manner that were supposed to be imitating African Americans. So the era was named after this practice, this Jim Crow character, this minstrelsy. So, should I wait?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So, if you can imagine, this is also the age of industrialization and the New South economy, but African Americans are living in this segregated and separate and unequal society. So we know later the separate but equal doctrine was proven to be inherently unequal. So when you're talking about the progressive era, you're talking about an era of reform in terms of the situations that growth in terms of industry, urbanization were causing in Americans' lives. And there were black progressives. So some of the most famous black progressive reformers Some of the most famous black progressive reformers were Booker T. Washington, who founded Tuskegee Institute, which would become Tuskegee University in 1881. W.E.B. Du Bois, famous writer, sociologist who worked at Atlanta University. And Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a journalist who would report on one of the greatest ills of African Americans were facing at the time, which was lynching. In the state of Georgia, between 1900 and 1931, there were 302 recorded lynchings. And she very bravely put herself on the front lines to report this kind of danger of just living and being black in the United States, and particularly in the South. So Booker T. Washington gave a famous speech in 1895 that was called the Atlanta Compromise speech. He gave it at the Cotton States exposition that was held in Atlanta at the time. And to give you an idea of what was going on in terms of race relations, he experienced firsthand. He was born into slavery. He experienced firsthand how difficult it was to live in a segregated society as an African American. But he would say, we have to work with what we have. And in this speech, he said, cast down your buckets where you are. So he was talking about a ship that was, lost at sea or something, and another ship comes by, and the ship that's lost says, water, water, I need water. We need water. And the ship that's approaching them says, cast down your buckets where you are. And they said, no, you don't understand. Like, we need fresh water to drink. And the ship just said, cast down your buckets where you are. And so he's saying, basically, you have to work with the situation you have. So this era is the era of increased immigration in the United States. And a lot of the factories that are being built would rather employ white immigrants than local African Americans. And so Booker T. Washington and other black leaders say, employ African Americans, cast down your buckets where you are. And African Americans work hard, build a farm, work hard, like we showed you the example. Build your own buildings, build your own educational institutions. And he would say, we people here in America, we people here in the South can be as separate as the fingers on a hand, but still work together like the hand does. So this is the situation that African Americans are faced with. They have this segregated society, and they have to try and make a living. They have to try and educate themselves, and so what do? And Booker T. Washington says, do for self. Get educated get an industrial education, and build up your own communities. But a W.E.B. Du Bois would come along and say, no, we're not accepting compromise. We won't accept compromise. It's not okay. You can't talk about segregation like it's just something that happens in a vacuum. People very violently uphold and maintain the color line. and we cannot accept this. We can't just say, okay, they don't want us to be very educated, so our schools are inferior. We will just be okay with an educational and industrial education. African Americans can have an industrial education, but they also deserve to be educated in the same way as everyone else in America, to learn the classics, to learn French. If they want to learn a violin, they should be able to. So W.E.B. Du Bois would be in the group of people who starts an organization called the Niagara Movement in 1906. And most of the people in the Niagara Movement, it was an interracial bunch of people, would go on to form the NAACP in 1909. African Americans, most African Americans, because of the legacy of slavery, because of Jim Crow, are very, very economically disadvantaged at the time. African Americans are being disenfranchised. They're kept from voting at the time, facing tremendous odds. But at the same time, they're institution building. So they're building churches like Macedonia Church to help each other. Often the church is a spiritual center at the time, but it's also like a self-help group. So you would find churches that sponsor schools like Morris Brown College. So there was Tuskegee Institute founded in 1881, but also here in Georgia, Morris Brown College was founded by the Black Church in 1881. Churches might help sponsor housing for people. They were very instrumental in helping house orphans, and they did all kinds of things. The African American community was very interested in institution building in this way. During the Progressive Era and during Reconstruction, they were very interested in getting educated. So I listed some colleges. Morehouse College was formed during Reconstruction. Spelman College, same thing, 1881, during this post-Reconstruction era. And so by the time of the Progressive Era, you have a growing middle class. So along with this degradation, along with this oppression that they're facing, they're also working to build communities, and they're growing in prosperity. So the second part of the question, was it World War I?
Yes.
So by the time, though, of World War I, the draft, the wartime economy caused labor shortages in factories. So the wartime economy demands more production at the same time as young, able-bodied men are being sent away to war. So one thing that happens is factories very pointedly, right, very methodically recruit African Americans to come north and work in the factories. So remember, a lot of times people weren't able to leave because they had these labor contracts that were dictated by the black codes that said you can't leave. Most African Americans at the time lived in the South and were sharecropping, or what people would call tenant farmers. That meant they didn't have any land after the Civil War. So they had to make a deal, often with their former slave masters, their former enslavers, to stay on some land. Maybe the person would give them, the landowner would give them tools, would give them seed, would give them a mule or a horse to use, would give them a plow, maybe a place to stay, a little cabin, sometimes their former cabin when they were enslaved, to stay in. And what the sharecropper promised, what the tenant farmer promised, was a share of their crops. Could be half of their crops when they came in, could be 2/3 of their crops. Different deals for different situations and different peoples. But the end result was that they were mired in a cycle of debt. They often, if they couldn't read or write, sometimes they could not contest what the landowner said they owed. But even if the landowner was on the up and up, these were really unequal situations that would cause problems. Say, for instance, if there was a problem with the crops in a certain year and your crop yield wasn't that good, but you still had to give half to the owner. And you might end up in debt because the owner might say, well, this doesn't cover all the seeds I gave you, the mule, etc. Right? So what African Americans, the situation that African Americans find themselves in on the eve of World War I, is, yeah, like I'm getting offers to come up north to work for wages, and I don't have to be in debt year over year. And someone I know, my cousin, my friend down the street, left under the cover of night often. Some people would say a recruiter from a northern factory might give them a ticket to get out of town, but they would have to hide the ticket in their shoe, because if the landowner found out, there'll be trouble, right? So often under the cover of night, some African Americans got out, went to the north, worked in factories for wages, and they were right back. Would contact family, would contact friends in the South and say, hey, this is much better than the South, come on up. So by 1916, between 1916 and 1970, about 6 million African Americans left the South to go to the North, to go to the Midwest, some eventually to the far West, to work in factories, to work in the industry, the military industrial complex, things like that. So whereas before World War I, most of the African American population was a Southern population, by 1970, almost half of the black population lived in northern, Midwestern, Western urban areas. And what's the other part?
Oh, that was question 3. But
Okay.
moving on to question 4, you already just touched on it, is about the Great Migration.
Okay.
But if you would like to elaborate a little bit more on how African American civil rights, if they faced more challenges in the North, was it less, was it more?
So in the North, African Americans found a different set of challenges. So people might go to the North and only be able to find work people might go to the North and only be able to find somewhere to live in a certain section of town. Maybe the city ordinances didn't say outright, like Atlanta might have said at the time, this is the Negro area, this is the colored area, and that's a city ordinance. That would be called de jure segregation. It's encoded in the law. But African Americans who went north may face overcrowding in certain areas that were designated, socially for African Americans only, and other places for whites only, right? And other places where the Jewish section of town, right? The Irish lived over here, right? And a lot of that segregation was what we would call de facto. It was just a matter of fact. It was a social custom. So in certain ways, that was a harder kind of oppression. That was a harder obstacle to face, because it was really fleeting. It was often hard to prove. It wasn't written in black and white like Southern ordinances that segregated and separated African Americans into unequal places with unequal status. So that's just one example of the types of hardship they would face. Also, if you're talking about the progressive era, the World War I era, racism wasn't just a Southern thing. I mean, if you look at, say for instance, President Woodrow Wilson, he endorsed segregation, and the American Civil Service was segregated. So maybe an African American had gone to a Morris Brown College, an Atlanta University, a Spelman College, a Morehouse College, to name some Georgia colleges that African Americans could go to. And they had an education, but could only find subservient positions because the law said, because custom said, we don't hire your type in these kinds of positions. So racism, segregation was really tricky. And a lot of African Americans would testify, life was so much better in the North. There were factors that pushed me out of the South. The boll weevil was destroying our crops, or I had a series of crop failures. I never could get out of debt when I was sharecropping. The violence, the lynchings, the debt peonage, right? When, I didn't have a job and I was picked up for loitering, and then I was sold to this company, this mining company that put me in the mines to work, and I didn't get paid for it because it was legal for, the state to sell me in that way. And I went to the North and I didn't have to face those things. The prospect of living in a situation where I didn't have to, at least nominally, I didn't have to face that kind of violence every day, or the better pay in the factory situation brought me to the North. And so that was much better, but we still faced some different obstacles.
In your opinion, are cemeteries such as the Macedonia Cemetery important to understanding historical time periods in the United States history, and why?
Yes, so cemeteries like Macedonia are very important in terms of helping us understand history. Cemeteries are, in general, very important pieces and parts of our history. So we can come in and we can look at the styles of the headstones and they tell us something. We can look at the names on the headstones and it leads us down an avenue of research that tells us about individuals, tells us about social customs, tells us about religious values. And cemeteries are very important and great learning tools. And I'm excited that you all are a part of this project. And I'm sure it helps doing this work of recovering these headstones and finding out what the church looks like, where it was located, is a good way to learn the utility of history. Because a lot of people say, history, what is it good for? You can't do anything with it. But in doing work like this, you really find a use for context for a lot of the sterile facts, right, that we learn out of books.
In your opinion, are cemeteries such as the Macedonia Cemetery important to our lives in today's society?
Yes, cemeteries such as Macedonia are important in our lives today. Cemeteries are monuments to the dead, right? And I don't think many people would question whether we need the Washington Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial. So the importance of a cemetery like Macedonia is to memorialize ordinary people. And if we really believe that our lives matter, my life matters, your lives matter, everybody's life matters, then we would understand the importance of memorializing everyday people as well and preserving their memories.
What were specific difficulties faced by Black Americans on their journey to the okay, let me restart that. What were specific difficulties faced by Black Americans on their journeys to the northern and western states, as well as the difficulty of starting new lives there?
So I think I addressed some of that question when I talked about the Great Migration. But a difficulty that a person might face, I think I talked about the threat of violence. Often labor contracts in the South had clauses that said the person couldn't leave the job, they couldn't protest their conditions. So they might have been seen as, right, considered to be breaking a contract. They would have been pursued. They might have faced violence for breaking this contract. So many had to leave secretly. But then there's also getting, just physically getting to the place, like how, if a recruiter didn't pay your way, how, if you were having trouble with debt, would you find a way physically to this other place? Would you know anyone there? It's very scary to leave where you've always grown up, where your family is, where your grandma is, where someone in your family might be buried, where you have a lot of history, where your church is, your social group, and go somewhere else totally different. So those first people, some people, the first people in their families, the first people in their areas might have gone to a place like Minnesota and may not have known a single soul. So that was also a hardship. And as I said, finding a suitable place to live, often the places that were set aside for African Americans were in disrepair, did not receive the same services that the white areas of town received. You asked about the progressive era, and even if a person was migrating during this period from a rural area into a city like Atlanta, they might have faced similar issues. So there's a progressive reformer in Atlanta named Eugenia Burns Hope, and she started an organization called the Neighborhood Union. And a part of the reason why she helped co-found the Neighborhood Union was because she saw firsthand her husband, John Hope, was the president of Morehouse College at the time. And then he went on to be the president of Atlanta University. And so they lived in Atlanta's West End, a black neighborhood. And she said, we pay taxes, but we don't receive the same city services in terms of lights, in terms of safe parks for our children to play in terms of the roads. They'll be unpaved, muddy, hard to pass in. There'll be water that collects in holes, and then the mosquitoes will become a problem. And we pay taxes. We pay the same taxes as people in the other part of town. So these are the kinds of conditions that African Americans would have found in a city like Atlanta, but also would have found in a city like Chicago, New York, Detroit, Cleveland, Ohio. Then there's another layer. I've been talking about race, but I haven't been talking about class as much. One of the critiques of W.E.B. Du Bois is that he has this idea that the most talented tenth of the African American community would be the leaders of the African American communities, which people would criticize and say the masses deserve to lead too, and they deserve to be groomed to lead, right? They deserve to be seen as capable potential leaders. So when African Americans from the South imagine, like I said, remember their schools are inferior by design, or they're not able to go to school for various reasons, like, well, we need you in the fields, right? Your dad's a sharecropper, he's behind, he's in debt. Your dad needs you to work in the field. I, the landowner, need you to work with your dad in the fields, picking, cotton or what have you. They would go north, and some middle class, upper class Northerners who were African Americans, in addition to the white Americans, would say, oh my gosh, where are these country people coming from? Oh, the schools are filling up with these people, and they cannot, I've got a whole bunch of fifth graders coming in, and they cannot read on the fifth grade level. What are we going to do? So that was another hardship, being an outsider in a new place, and coming with, facing obstacles that may have been because of the oppression that you face in the South. So those were just some of the issues that African Americans faced when they migrated.
Okay. And then what struggles were prevalent within communities like colorism, intersectionality between race and gender, sexuality, etc.? And how did that shape the civil rights movement?
So I want to make sure I got the question. What struggles were prevalent in African American society in the North? And so colorism, was it an issue? Was sexism or gender discrimination an issue? Right. And how did that affect the civil rights movement?
Yeah.
So the colorism was an issue, right? So what is colorism? Colorism is color discrimination within a race, within an ethnic group that is, really generated by the dominant culture's racism. So people who are lighter skinned, hair texture would be, also an issue, right? People with straighter hair, people with lighter eyes might be favored because of their proximity to concept of white beauty, the worth of white people, their motivation, their intelligence, right? So that was an issue and still remains an issue within the African American community. So it's a complicated thing to really parse through, because a part of what happens is that the talented 10th that Du Bois was referring to also happened to be lighter skinned, with looser hair textures, because initially coming out of slavery, some of those people they had been free African Americans, or they had been freed from slavery, or even if they were freed because of the end of the Civil War, they might have had some privilege because their parent, their father, might have been the slaveholder. So to give you an example of a woman who was in that kind of situation, look up the story of Amanda America Dixon. David Dixon was her father, but also her slave owner and her mother's slave owner. And her grandmother, her father's mother, told David, this child looks like you, bring the child to me. Bring the child to as they would say, the big house. And eventually Amanda was sent to school. She was sent to tutoring because, of course, she was black, right? She was biracial, so she couldn't go to school with the other slaveholders, white kids. So the Dixons brought in tutors for her and sent her to Atlanta University. And when her dad died, she inherited his fortune. So I don't know if you're familiar with Madam C.J. Walker. A lot of people know her as one of the first millionaires in the African American community. But in fact, less people know about Amanda America Dixon. Madam C.J. Walker was self-made. Amanda America Dixon inherited her father's wealth, and it was because he had been a slaveholder. He had owned her mother and her. And so these types of people are some of the people who form the early black middle class. And so what you have is an overlap of their color, their skin color, their hair texture, and their wealth and their status and the kind of power that they can garner. So that just adds to issues of colorism. But not all African Americans who are prosperous, who are leaders, at the time are lighter skinned. So there are darker skinned African Americans, but colorism is and was an issue in terms of social mobility.
And is there any correlation with how it affected the civil rights movement directly?
So, is there a correlation with how it impacts the civil rights movement? Some of the people from the leading families came from some of those families that came from the folks who, inherited wealth from enslavers, because the enslavers were their relatives, right? I do more research on the Black Power movement, and colorism really gets put on the table during the Black Power movement. Now, some people consider Black Power as a part of the civil rights movement or a post-civil rights movement, but the issue of colorism really comes to the forefront in the Black Power movement because people talk about it openly, and they say color, is and was an issue within our communities. But yeah, you can see that some of the more prosperous, prominent families who are leaders in the black community might be of a lighter hue because of their connections. Now, that's not the only reason why a person would become a leader. The black church produced a lot of leaders. So think like 100 elected officials during Reconstruction were ministers, about 100, right? They also come from, the people who had gone to the war, men who had gone to the war and were veterans. It just depends on the situation, but not all black leaders come from that class, but a lot of the leadership did, yes.
And is there anything else you'd like to add to this interview?
No, I just really appreciate you all for interviewing me and for doing this work on this cemetery. It's so important, and I really wish that everybody's historical project could have a wonderful team like you of researchers.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Hopefully I wasn't too long-winded.
No, and then before we go, if you could just say your name and then kind of just
say it to them.
Yeah.
To them. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I looked down because something stung me while I was here. I don't know if it was a bee or.
There's bugs everywhere.
Yeah, I got ant bites.
Ant bites, yeah. And I don't think, was I too close?
No.
Okay. So just say my name?
And like what you do.
Yeah.
Just a quick little. Yeah.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
I'm Kenja McCray, and I am, sorry.
Take your time.
I'm Kenja McCray, and I am an associate professor of history at Atlanta Metropolitan State College and a visiting associate professor at Georgia Tech. Can I do it again?
Yeah.
I don't know why I said everything else, but I can't say my name and title. Okay. I am Kenja McCray, and I am an associate professor of history at Atlanta Metropolitan State College and a visiting associate professor of history at Georgia Institute of Technology.
Perfect.
Okay.